Good morning, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for joining our Maternity Matters webinar series today. So, taking place during Baby Loss Awareness Week and a couple of days after World Mental Health Day, this webinar focuses on maternal mental health. And we know that maintaining good maternal health leads to better outcomes for mothers and children. I would just also mention that because this is such a broad and wide-ranging topic, this webinar is part one of two relating to mental health, with part two focused specifically on baby loss and bereavement. And that webinar will take place next month, and details will follow at the end of today. So our aim this morning is to highlight the issues which can arise in pregnancy and following childbirth, which can adversely affect new mothers and their mental health. And we know, according to the Royal College of Psychiatrists, that as many as 1 in 5 women have mental health problems in pregnancy or afterwards. Our programme today includes client testimony, and you'll also hear practical guidance and advice on how to best support all mothers and their families during pregnancy, birth, and in the postnatal period from our panel of experts. So just a few housekeeping points to start. Thank you to those who've already submitted questions. You can submit additional questions throughout the session via the Q&A function on your screen, and we will answer those at the end during the panel Q&A. When submitting questions, please include your name and email address so that if we can't get to your question during the live session, we can respond directly afterwards by email. We will, as ever, be recording this event, and the recording will be sent out afterwards to all who have signed up. And towards the end of the session, we'll be posting a feedback link. So please take 2 minutes or so at the end to let us have your feedback. I'll remind you again at the very end. Right, so starting today, we are joined by Nikki Wilson, who's the CEO of the charity Make Birth Better, Julia Pavia, a specialist community midwife, Dr. Nusrat Mir, perinatal psychiatrists, and those experts will be joined by Banish Nazmeen, who's chair of the Association of Asian Midwives, in our panel discussion later on in the morning. But we start with testimony from clients, and I would like to introduce Rochelle Mahapatra, who's a partner in our Leeds office alongside Victoria Moss, a solicitor, and her team, who will speak with their clients, Whitney and Andrew Pickup, parents of Matilda, about their experience. Thank you, and over to Rochelle.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us to talk about this very important and incredibly sad topic. Also like to thank Whitney and Andrew, our clients who have been brave enough to keep talking about this topic. I think incredibly brave of them to raise awareness in this area, which as we know as solicitors who represent clients who suffer from these tragedies, the more awareness and safety discussions that take place, the better, really. I'm just going to tell you about their daughter, Matilda. Matilda was the second child of Whitney and Andy. Their first child, Charlie, was born at LGI in 2015, and as a result of an emergency situation, he was born by caesarean section. So when Whitney found out she was pregnant with her second child, planning was obviously very important, and one of the important issues in this case for the family was that they were told by their consultants that the medical records from the first delivery would be transferred so that everything could be done to act in the most safe way. So Whitney was admitted to Harrogate Hospital 2nd of July 2018, and unfortunately things deteriorated quite quickly. The CTG became pathological. There were long delays, and it wasn't until nearly 2 a.m. the next day that Matilda was delivered, and very sadly in a poor condition because she'd suffered a hypoxic brain injury by that point. So the family were transferred to Bradford Royal Infirmary for special care, and unfortunately Matilda didn't live. She died at Martin House Children's Hospice when she was a few days old. So the process to the investigation first started an internal investigation with a root cause analysis, which we'll talk about with Victoria, their solicitor, a little bit later. There was also a civil claim for damages, and there was also an inquest, which very sadly, I think, didn't take place until just over I think it was 2 years later, which for a family who are grieving, the legal process has been very protracted. And I think Andy and Whitney will talk about the impact on their health, really, and their well-being, for something that didn't really need to take so long. The inquest finally found that the delay and the hypoxia contributed to Matilda's death. So the happy news is that they've gone on to have another baby, which we can talk about, Isaac, as well, in 2020. And I just wanted to start, really, firstly by thanking you both for coming today, but also just to start talking about the process, really, Andy. And if I could ask you, in those early days in the hospital, I know you moved hospitals, but was the support network there for you?
Hi, everybody. To be honest, at Harrogate Hospital, where Matilda was born, I wouldn't say there was a lot of help or assistance there, albeit we wasn't there very long before we got transferred. It was all very very almost rushed and panicked, and I just don't think they were prepared for this situation. And yes, we had no support at the time at the hospital where Matilda was born. When we was transferred to Bradford, we did have the support we had was probably mainly from the nurses, and that was looking after Matilda in intensive care. We was there for 9 days with Matilda before we was transferred to Martin House Children's Hospice. So at Bradford Hospital we did get, but that was more from the nurses. That was helping looking after Matilda, basically. But I wouldn't say there was any specific support in terms of trained support, if that makes sense, like psychiatrists or anything. We didn't get any help as such there. It was just purely by the caring NHS staff, as opposed to trained specialists.
And if I can just ask you, Andy, about the investigation, how much did they include you in that investigation, and did they explain to you what the purpose of that was?
When we was at Bradford, we almost straight away we knew something wasn't right, in terms of it wasn't just one of those things that happened. We kind of realised quite quickly that actually this is something more than just something that happens, really, in terms of we noticed something went wrong. So we was basically talking about that with Bradford Hospital, and it wasn't until the day before we was transferred to Martin House, so it was day 8, that Bradford, I believe Bradford's one of the head consultants at Bradford, spoke to Harrogate, and I believe it was Dr. Chakra, who basically expressed what his concerns were, and I don't think they realised they did anything wrong until that point. In honesty, I don't think there was even going to be an investigation internally. They just basically transferred us to Bradford, and I believe that they thought that was it, really. We didn't get any, there was no communication, and it wasn't until that point then then they started to almost get in touch. But yeah, we didn't really see any support at that. Still no support at that point.
So, having received the report and the conclusions of the investigation, did the hospital talk to you about how they were going to implement any training or changes to the process so that really that this couldn't happen again?
Yes,
no,
well,
they
no.
didn't. I spoke to the head midwife, who was sort of looking after us, and she wasn't the warmest of people, really. And she basically, well, no, they didn't even tell us. It was me that asked if they'd made any changes.
Yeah.
And she said that she'll find out.
Yeah,
they had. But we know from people since Matilda passing who've had bad experiences at Harrogate. So I don't think they have implemented everything. Just
going back to when they was doing the root cause analysis, we was basically, as soon as we basically Matilda passed away, we got I think we got a phone call to ask if we wanted to have a post-mortem undertaken from the coroners. We had to inform, I can't remember which way around it was, but the coroner got in touch and said there would have to be a post-mortem, which we agreed to. There was a lot of delays then. There was barely little communication between us and the hospital and the coroners, and we couldn't actually have Matilda's funeral for 3 months. They held Matilda at the coroners for 3 months because of the lack of hospital. She was in Newcastle Hospital, where she was transferred from Martin House for the post-mortem. And we had to. It wasn't until we sat down with Harrogate, two and a half months later, when they presented the root cause analysis, and we was like, well, we've been asking what's happening, and have we got the information to basically to lay Matilda to rest. And it wasn't until we were sat in Harrogate Hospital, which was very difficult to actually have the meeting at Harrogate Hospital. We had to do that reluctantly. We'd have rather have had it somewhere else, but we was told it was not an option. So we've met there, and they explained the initial root cause analysis, and it was only then, when we was pushing for Matilda to be released, for us to be able to have Matilda's funeral, which was exactly 3 months to the day we did, which is today. It's actually 4 years ago today, as it goes.
I'm sorry it's today, and you're so brave about being able to talk about these subjects. We're going to hear about from Dr. Nusrat later. I mean, as a family, if this had been approached in a different way, that things had happened quickly, that you'd been given answers, and people had come back to you and said, this shouldn't have happened, it's a tragedy, but actually you knew the answer less than a year and a half after the event, you didn't have to wait for a funeral. Do you think that would have helped you with the grieving process?
Yeah, we were just numb. We couldn't do anything. It was like I'll call it a life, but it didn't really feel like a life. It was just our lives just put on hold. And when we did have Charlie, our eldest son, which kept us going. But yeah, if we hadn't had Charlie, I think we'd have been in a much worse position, particularly with our mental health and coping. We didn't have the help that we needed.
I'm just going to move over to Victoria now, Andy. I might come back to both of you in a minute, but Victoria, thank you for joining us. Victoria Moss is one of our lead solicitors who represented the family. Victoria, do you want to explain, when we pursue a claim following a very, very sad situation like this, what the actual legal framework is, what the process is? Do you want to just explain how we look at these claims?
Hi everybody. Yeah, of course. So for a legal claim, there is essentially a two-stage test that we have the burden of proof of establishing. the first thing we have to show is something called breach of duty. So that is that there was essentially a failing in the care that Whitney and Matilda received. For something to be classed as a failure and meet that particular legal standard, it's not a case of measuring it against gold standard. It's just what reasonable care would be. So it is quite a high threshold to meet. If you can establish that there have been failings in care, then the second part of that legal test is something known as causation. So we also have to show that there's been a consequence of that failure of care. So in Matilda's case, we had to show that the outcome of her birth would have been different. In other words, we had to prove that she would have survived, and the level of proof we have to show that is on the balance of probability, so more likely than not. So it's not an easy legal test to satisfy, because there's multiple hurdles to get over, and unfortunately to do that it's quite a long process, which again doesn't make it easy for the families. We have to get medical records, sometimes have to wait for the inquest outcomes, and in a lot of cases we need independent expert evidence to support the claim. So that's in a nutshell what we had to show to be successful in Matilda's case.
So having gone through a whole investigation internally into what happened, did you find that the legal process was quick, that they came back and admitted liability, just so that, you know, to help the family move on?
Yeah, so unfortunately that wasn't the case here. So the final root cause analysis report, I believe the final version was signed off in November 2018, which was 4 months after Matilda's death. So, you know, not particularly quick for Andy and Whitney, but relatively in the grand scheme of things. And a few months after that, I think it was around that time that we met Andy and Whitney and became involved. And we wrote to the trust very early on and asked if they were going to make a formal admission of liability. Just because failings are identified in an internal investigation, that doesn't automatically equate to an admission of liability in a legal sense. So we asked the trust if they would do so, and we didn't get, you know, they didn't want to do so at that time. There was an inquest due to take place in June 2020, and unfortunately that was postponed indefinitely due to COVID, and that didn't take place until April 2021. Quite often in these cases, sometimes the inquest can prove as a helpful tool for resolving the legal claim, and possibly that is what the trust were wanting to wait for, but because of the delay with that due to COVID, we then had to undertake a full investigation ourselves, obtaining the expert evidence and then presenting that in full essentially to the defendant and asking again, will you now make an admission of liability? And then they did some more of their own investigations, and I believe it was November 2020, so 2 years after the internal investigation, that the trust said, yes, okay, we will accept liability.
Thanks for that, Victoria. And, you know, money never can, you know, put the clock back and put people, you know, stop these things being so painful. But when we look at damages, what sorts of things are we claiming for?
So for Matilda's claim, unfortunately, the scope is relatively limited. We can claim something known as general damages, and that is a pot of money to compensate Matilda for the pain and suffering that she went through in the 9 days that she survived. Unfortunately, the way the guidance is on general damages is the amount of money you receive for pain and suffering can only be awarded for a period of time that somebody is alive. So because there was only 9 days of pain and suffering for Matilda, it's a very, very limited amount of money. I think the guidance is a few £1,000s in that case. And then in addition to that you're also able to claim any financial loss that impacts the family. So in a case similar to Matilda's, and in Matilda's case, that will have been things like any costs that Andy and Whitney paid for her funeral, any additional travel costs because, you know, they were in hospital with her, going back and forth, family visiting, and again, if they'll have, you know, prepared for Matilda's arrival, those sorts of purchases you could also claim. In addition to Matilda's claim, we also investigated separate claims for Andy and Whitney in their own right. They are also entitled to claim money for their pain and suffering for the kind of psychiatric impact of the case, and then again financial losses associated with it. So if a psychiatrist recommends treatment or therapy, we can claim the cost for them to go and get that treatment and therapy. So those are the sorts of things that are included.
Thank you, Victoria. That was really helpful. And if I could just move back to Andy and Whitney. We talked a lot about what you wanted to get or things to improve in this process. You've talked about Matilda's law. Andy, do you want to explain what that means?
Yes, so basically with the findings and the legal process that Victoria did for us, it became apparent that one of the big things with Matilda was the notes from Leeds wasn't shared. We was quite concerned. It was quite a traumatic birth with Charlie, our first child. In 2015, it was very traumatic, and last minute at Leeds Hospital, and we were living in Leeds at the time of Charlie's birth, and then we moved areas, so we was then in Harrogate when we was expecting Matilda, so we was under the care of Harrogate rather than Leeds, and basically the notes. It was stressed very early on by the consultant and the consultant-led care Whitney received that the notes was very important to obtain prior to the arrival of Matilda, so that they could make decisions on the birth. And we feel that if the notes had been requested, like we was told there were, but the findings, I don't believe there was any evidence to say that they did actually request them. We feel that there is no system or consequences in place for not requesting the notes. So we want to push for, in memory of Matilda, that notes are made mandatory, because we feel in this case with Matilda that she would have been here today if the notes had been shared. We believe she would have been here today. So that's what we're pushing for.
Thanks, Andy. And I suppose with a computerised system around the NHS, they would also be able to share much more easily. I just wanted to turn to Isaac. You've had another little boy.
Yes.
And how's he doing?
Yeah, he's good. Yeah, he's about as cheeky as Charlie is. So yeah, got his hands full, which is good.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, he's 2.5 now. Yeah.
And how did you find things had changed with your last delivery? Whitney, I know you've got a terrible cold, so I know you might not want to talk. But do you think things had improved by the time you got to the delivery with Isaac?
Basically, we'd at that point we were as soon as things changed in terms of both Charlie and Matilda came naturally for us, but unfortunately when we decided we did want another child, we found out that we couldn't conceive naturally. So unfortunately we had to go down the route of IVF with Isaac. So that was all planned, if you want to call it planned, or that was it obviously was trying. So when it came to just before we was planning everything, we got in touch with an obstetrician, who basically we had almost private obstetrician care that we paid for, right from literally almost from the embryo being planted as Isaac, from right through to the obstetrician delivering Isaac by planned cesarean all the way through. So that's what we felt we needed to, just from a trust point of view. We'd lost the trust in the NHS partly because of the notes not being shared, and we felt that that was the only way we could cope with the situation. And it was a big worry that if Isaac had came early, that we would have ended up at Harrogate Hospital as opposed to the hospital where Isaac was born. So yeah, it was quite a big deal for us, and it was a lot to cope with at the time. And unfortunately, when he was born, it was April 2020, so it was a very different experience with COVID, and I was only allowed in there for 5 minutes. It wasn't very a good experience, but obviously that wasn't the NHS's fault. But yeah, everything went well because we had somebody we could trust all the way through the process.
So our takeaways from today, really, Andy, is that, you know, lessons need to be learned, that things need to be very different, that they need to communicate better with families. In the process, I mean, what would be the things? I know you talked about Matilda's law, but if you were to get everything that you felt was important now, would it just be that they're open, honest, that they actually communicate better? What would be your takeaways from your experience?
For me as well, just by our experience in speaking to other people who've lost children, there isn't enough support. You know, one of Isaac's friends, his lost their sister at 18 months old, and they had no support or anything, and that they were born at Harrogate. But yeah, there's just not enough support for families.
Yeah, the only support we got was from Martin House. We kept getting told we'd get support, but we never actually did. It just did not happen. Every time we asked for it, we didn't get the support. We only got support from Martin House and paying privately.
And now, I mean, you're both well, and have you been able to go back to work, both of you?
Yes, we're both back at work. Obviously, it's just a challenge. I mean, I've got my own business. Whitney works for the business as well. So we're kind of fortunate-ish that we could rely on other people, but equally we had no choice because we needed to work to be able to provide for his family. So we didn't really have a choice. But yeah, we are back at work, and we still take each day as it comes, and some days are a challenge and some days are okay.
Thank you for that, Andy and Whitney. And I just wanted to finish with you, Victoria. In the process, what do you think would help in these very tragic cases to change in terms of the system? What would you like to see from a legal perspective?
I think not just Andy and Whitney, but other families I've worked with, some of the common themes is that they just want cooperation and open and honesty at the very earliest stage. So if a mistake has been made, if something's not quite gone right, to kind of admit that and speak to the families about that and explain what's happened. You know, most families just want to know what has happened to their child. And then the other thing is the reassurance that it's not going to happen again. So I think as quickly and as early as possible, you know, be open and honest about what's happened, provide that full explanation, you know, and just give vague answers. They want to know every detail of what has happened, and then again go through everything that the trust is going to do to make sure it improves. One thing that lots of families will speak to me about when we're dealing with the legal claim is, can we find out if that policy that they said they were going to introduce has been introduced? Can we find out if that particular member of staff got the extra training? And quite often it's hard to get those answers. And I think if the trust communicated those things at an earlier stage as possible, that would be really helpful for families. And then similarly, if those internal investigations are quite clear and obvious as to what the end result is going to be, if the family do decide to proceed with the legal claim, why, you know, the need to go through that entire investigation process again and put the family through another year, 2 years of trauma, it'd be much easier if they can work more collaboratively and just say, actually, this is something we can resolve nice and quickly, so that the family can just grieve and start to find some closure with the process.
Thanks for that, Victoria. I just wanted to read, we've just had a delegate comment, Paddy Forbes, consultant obstetrician, I'm sure is well known to all of you, who's actually made the comment that even with computerised records, trusts work in silos and cannot access other trust records online. At present, apart from radiology, records are mostly transferred on paper and are often very difficult to follow. Attempts to unify have failed. One option is for parents to be given copies of their records. It's all very unsatisfactory. I'm just going to leave you with that note. Thank you very much, Paddy, for that comment. As much debate and discussion about these topics, it's very important to get change in the system. And obviously, Matilda's law looks like it's even more important for us to actually raise this very important issue. So thank you to Andy and Whitney for your bravery this morning. Thank you very much, Victoria, for your clear guidance on the legal framework. There will be people for a Q&A later. Please keep adding those questions, and I'm now going to hand back to Anne to introduce the next speaker. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rochelle, and a huge thank you to Andy and Whitney for sharing their experience. It just goes to show it never leaves you. You never really get over these things. So coming now to one of our guest speakers, who is Nikki Wilson. She's the CEO of the charity Make Birth Better. And Make Birth Better was established to improve the whole birth experience for women, their partners, as well as the professionals who support them. So I'm going to hand over to Nikki now. And thank you, Nikki, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I think my oh, there we go. Look at that. So today's presentation is going to be around who we are, what we do, and we're going to be discussing more around birth trauma. I also really want to express my gratitude to Andy and Whitney. Thank you for sharing your story, and I'm sorry for your experience and your loss. So in our team, so next slide please. In our team we have a range of wonderful women. So we were co-founded top left by Dr. Rebecca Moore, who is a consultant psychiatrist, also by Dr. Emma Svanberg next to her there, who is a clinical psychologist. We also have Zakina there as our community lead. We have Lauren as our support services lead. We have Dr. Jan Smith there, bottom left, who is a chartered psychologist and our clinical lead. That's me. And then we have Aveline, our comms lead, and Trudy, our training lead. And we also are supported by a range of individuals and organisations, including Irwin Mitchell. We have about 150 champions who are out there very much flying the flag for us and our mission to make birth better. So who are we? So we are a unique collective of parents and professionals, and Anne covered that there in our introduction. So next slide, please. Our mission is really quite simple: to end suffering from birth trauma. And what makes us slightly different is how we take a very systemic view and very systemic approach. And by that, I mean that we believe that we cannot prevent birth trauma from happening unless we work with every layer of the system. So we're looking baby, mother and birthing person, the partners, the family, the professionals around that, the teams, the organisations and society at large. So it's a big span of layers that we want to consider. In practice, in terms of what we actually do on our day-to-day, how we offer support and how we're trying to affect change. So we provide support through our website, through our social media, our blog, and through inquiries to our inbox. We actively are training nationwide, largely into the NHS, but also other third sector organisations. We're seeing brilliant uptake of training at the moment, which is fantastic. And then we are doing a lot of campaigning. We have 2 campaigns running at the moment, one called No More Excuses, demanding increased investment in maternity services, and another called Think Trauma Now, which is about raising awareness across the piece around birth trauma. Next slide, please. So this quote here is really important to us to share, to bring us back to the basics of our common humanity. One of our core values at Make Birth Better is compassion. And I know a lot of people listening to this webinar will be healthcare professionals. So we know it's important to acknowledge the pressure and challenge that many healthcare professionals, particularly those working in the NHS, are facing. Many came into their roles because they believe in creating protected and safe spaces, they believe in humanising the birth experience. So that's really important for us to acknowledge at the very start, whenever we come to talk about birth trauma, whenever we know we are addressing healthcare professionals, that this idea of humanity is absolutely key. And also because when we get into a bit more on trauma, what trauma is, you'll see it's very much part of the human condition. And a lot of this is about working towards really going back to basics of our common humanity, how we exist together as humans. Next slide, please. So what is birth trauma? So let me just tell you a little bit more about that. Just to really get to the birth trauma part, I'm going to start with a definition of what trauma is at the broader level. Next slide, please. So you can see here, this is a definition that comes out of the Mental Health Administration in the States. The words in purple are the ones that are worth paying the most attention to. So individual trauma results from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional or spiritual well-being. So 70% of adults across the world will have experienced at least one traumatic event. And as you can see here, the reason we like this definition is it really demonstrates just how wide-reaching the impacts can be. And what's important to know is that definitely there are groups and communities who are much more susceptible to suffering from trauma. But really, as I said before, trauma is part of the human condition. It doesn't discriminate. So symptoms of trauma can be experienced by anybody, regardless of age, gender, socioeconomic status, race, geography, and so on. So it's just really important for us all to be aware of. So the next slide, please. So just a quick note on this before we get into the specifics of birth trauma. The last slide was a very diagnostic view on what trauma is, and traditionally that's how we've viewed this word trauma, as a search for perhaps symptoms that meet a clinical criteria within a diagnostic manual. You know, we're perhaps trying to marry potential trauma symptoms to a diagnosis. As the years go by, trauma is taking on a more kind of cultural context, and the meaning of trauma is broadening. So, for example, people might not be talking, when they talk about their own trauma, they may not be talking about an event or a series of events. They might be talking more about life circumstances. So a study in 2020 that interviewed a series of Black teenagers showed that for them, they identified their trauma as poverty, as housing, as police harassment, as discrimination. So it's really important that we really listen to people when they're talking about what they mean by their trauma and how it affects them as a human being. Next slide, please. So fitting birth into the mix. You'll notice these other bubbles are all things that we quite comfortably associate with trauma. Loss, disaster, war, violence, neglect, and so on. And then there's birth in a different colour. And why is that in a different colour? It's in a different colour for lots of different reasons. 20 years ago, Susan Ayres, who's one of the leading researchers around birth trauma, at the beginning of her research journey was told categorically by leading politicians in this country that birth cannot be a traumatic experience. It was only in 2014, so 8 years ago, that birth was recognised by NICE in this country, within the NICE guidelines, that birth could be a potentially traumatic experience. So it's really new in this space, birth and birth trauma. And why it stands apart is because birth can be a positive experience. And though in not all cases, many people do choose birth, whereas you wouldn't choose any of the other bubbles in this space. There's also the interesting and different cultural context around birth, which is that by and large, we expect birth to be a positive experience. Culturally, we place the emphasis on the baby much more than the mother, the birthing person, or the partner. And we really do tend to place that baby first, that at least you have a healthy baby. Is a term that's often used, which can of course mean that people who are suffering really with birth trauma to feel that their experiences are not valid. Trauma can feel like a very big word. Next slide, please. So birth trauma describes the symptoms of trauma related to the birth itself and or circumstances around the birth. So this is really key. So what we mean here is that an individual felt intensely afraid, fearful, out of control or helpless when they were giving birth, when they were pregnant or trying to become pregnant, or after the birth itself. And that experience has left a really lasting imprint on that individual physically or mentally. So whilst birth trauma has become the phrase that has become popularised, in many cases it's not actually that helpful, those two words together, because we default to assume that we're exclusively talking about the birth experience itself. And whilst we are in some cases and in many cases, we're not always, and I'll come on to talk a bit more about that in the next few slides. So if we were getting really picky about this, and mental health professionals tend to prefer this phrase perinatal trauma, which is more of an umbrella term. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is an example from Emma, and she's sharing a little bit about her experience of the birth itself and just a few indications as to what she felt were those particularly distressing moments. So there were moments of great panic for me when all I heard were phrases or words such as forceps, theatre, abandon, go to theatre. I didn't know what was happening to me or why I had no control over what people were doing to me. The trauma of her birth and those early days haunted me. It changed who I was and how I saw the world. So those words are really, really powerful. They're very telling and they're very illustrative of a lot of the stories that we listen to and that we hear. There's themes here around lack of control, intense fear, discomfort with language, and someone fundamentally feeling unsafe in their experience. next slide, please. So, when we look beyond the birth itself, we realise that there are multiple other places within that perinatal journey where people can experience extreme distress, fear, helplessness, and therefore where their trauma may in fact be pinpointed or contributed to. I'm just going to leave you for a moment to read these quotes, and please take care because this content can be distressing, very difficult to read. So if we consider each of these just quickly individually, so miscarriage, of course, and pregnancy loss can be an incredibly distressing experience for many, many people. So we know at least 25% of women or birthing people who experience pregnancy loss will, so 25% of them will meet the clinical diagnosis of PTSD 1 month after their loss. And of course, miscarriage or pregnancy loss is one example under an umbrella that you might call reproductive trauma. So this might include infertility diagnosis, recurrent pregnancy loss, the impact of fertility treatment, and so on. So there's a lot in there. And stats coming out of the States show that 30% of women and birthing people experience some kind of difficulty with their fertility. So it's a big number. Hyperemesis, so of course this is very extreme pregnancy sickness. We know, again, similar statistics, about 20% experience the full experience of PTSD after they have experienced hyperemesis. And really, when you unpick it, you consider unrelenting retching, vomiting, perhaps not being believed by healthcare professionals or friends and loved one around them, feeling very helpless and knowing that their baby is at increased risk. When you look at it like that, it makes absolute sense that people may find this experience extremely distressing. And then breastfeeding. One where we perhaps don't commonly link those two words together, breastfeeding and trauma. We know physically that breastfeeding can be impacted if someone has had a physically or mentally traumatic experience during the birth itself. We know that previous trauma can come into play here. So if you consider that 20% of women in this country alone have been a victim of sexual abuse, that's tightly linked to people having very distressing experiences with breastfeeding. And there's some brilliant work here. I would reference the work of Professor Amy Brown, really beginning to unpick what is breastfeeding grief, what is breastfeeding loss, and it comes up a lot for people, and it's very taboo, a subject that's not talked about enough and really, really very much should be. So next slide, please. So there have been a decent number of studies now on birth trauma, which give us a flavour of just how many people in the UK find their experience, and we're talking about the birth itself here, in some way traumatic. So that statistic is somewhere between 25 and 40% of women and birthing people in this country. What we know from there is that many of those people will go on to experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress, and a number, although a minority of those individuals, will go on to meet the full clinical diagnosis of PTSD, so about 3 to 8%. We also know that the experience of birth trauma is comorbid with depression and anxiety and OCD. What's really important here, and what we're working with healthcare professionals to better understand and recognise, is that birth trauma is different. It meets a different set of symptoms, different symptomology, and actually requires a different treatment pathway. So it's so important that we're better understanding and aware of birth trauma and how it presents. What's really important to take away from this is that birth trauma presents on a scale, and often people use PTSD and birth trauma interchangeably when really they shouldn't. People can experience mild, moderate and severe symptoms of birth trauma. But what's really important is to acknowledge that those people who do experience mild to moderate symptoms may suffer a serious impact on their life. They may feel fundamentally unsafe in the world. They may feel that they're very much struggling. So we shouldn't default to focusing exclusively on those more severe experiences where people perhaps meet that clinical diagnosis of PTSD. We should be really learning and hoping to address that full spectrum of people's experiences. So on the next slide, I'm going to play you a video. This is a video which has been produced by one of our collaborators, Pregnant Then Screwed, and it's just a nod at this point to really acknowledge, of course, the additional layer of trauma that for many people COVID-19 created. Okay, Thais, it doesn't look like it's playing. That's no problem. Oh, here we go. We can hear the music, but not the video. Oh, we got it. My knees fall down.
Having to do with childbirth in normal times is worrying enough.
Giving birth can be scary enough.
Hospitals are removing services they normally offer.
Partners were not allowed to be present.
After losing my son at full term during labour, I was now pregnant again, but going to appointments completely by myself.
Alone, by myself. I went in by myself.
It's on me. The separation of pregnant people and their partners is leading to long-term mental health issues.
This is a mental health epidemic.
I left the hospital with PTSD.
19 months on, it stays with me every day.
It broke me.
Alone, scared. It was a very lonely, very scary experience.
Thank you. My time with you. Thank you. Always likes to play twice, that one. My knees fall down. Thank you. So I think that video says it all. Always brings a tear to my eye. I had my third baby during COVID, and I know Andy and Whitney obviously talked about their experience too with Isaac. So, what to look for when you are trying to understand or identify people who are suffering from birth trauma across the scale. So you may be able to identify one of these symptoms, or perhaps if someone is expressing all of these symptoms, and this is where a psychiatrist, as you're going to hear from later, would assess fully, and someone would be having to meet all 4 of these symptoms for at least a month to reach the PTSD diagnosis. So there's 4 themes here. We're talking about people re-experiencing their traumatic experience, and a flashback here may not be a flashback as we imagine them. It may be as simple of a smell that perhaps takes them back to the room or where they remember being. Some people often quote perhaps strong cleaning products that takes the smell, takes them right back. Using avoidance behaviours, here you might be looking at someone who's avoiding their pregnant friends, doesn't want to go back to the hospital. Feeling a heightened sense of threat, this is people who will be very jumpy, very irritable. It's a big part of what contributes to this sense of feeling unsafe. They may feel very hyper alert. This may make them quicker to anger, more irritable, more angry and rageful. And negative thoughts and feelings, this can present as someone feeling very flat, very self-critical, very focused on guilt or shame. I just want to bring my personal experience into these examples to bring that to life a bit more. So I suffered postnatal PTSD in 2014, and I can so clearly see my own symptoms in these 4 criteria. So to give you an example of what re-experiencing felt like to me, I'd had an experience in the hospital where I believed myself to be dying, and The process of falling asleep when I got home felt very similar to that experience of believing myself to be dying in hospital. So I couldn't sleep unless somebody, and I had to have my mum at my bedside holding my hand, telling me I was safe, that I wasn't dying, that it wasn't the same. It's not the same. Avoidance behaviours, and the first time we tried to drive down the road towards the birthing centre, we had to turn around because the sense of sheer panic and overwhelm, which I absolutely was not expecting, was so strong, so palpable. I could not drive down that road. Heightened sense of threat was very pertinent for me. I couldn't leave my own bedroom or look out the window. Got a very leafy view out of this window without having a panic attack because it was too bright, too stimulated, that I was so vigilant. And then those negative thoughts and feelings played out for me of an intense fear that I might harm my baby by accident somehow, and a deep held belief that I would, quite frankly, never ever be the same person again. So hopefully that brings to life the symptoms for you. So next slide, please. So what causes birth trauma? How am I doing for time? Check in. Just perhaps Alex or Julianne could tell me how I'm doing. Am I okay? Not overrunning yet. Just keep going.
You're fine,
okay.
Nikki. Thank
I'm
you.
fine. Okay, so what causes birth trauma? So next slide, please. So this is really important, this quote here from Cheryl Beck. It's dropped off the reference there as I've converted this to PowerPoint. It's normally a Google slide. Birth trauma lies in the eye of the beholder. Mothers perceive that their traumatic births often were viewed as routine by clinicians. So this is so important. What can appear as an obstetrically straightforward birth when we're looking at the physiology of what occurred, what the healthcare professionals may have deemed to be an ordinary birth, can absolutely be felt as traumatic by that individual. And on the reverse side, we have those who have an objectively traumatic experience. Let's say, for example, they had a birth with forceps, or they had an emergency cesarean section. That individual may not go on to have any symptoms of trauma. So it's really those words, it's in the eye of the beholder. It's subjective, and that's so important to hold in mind. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, there are circumstances that make people or communities more likely to find birth traumatic. This is just a flavour. We in fact have a slide that has a list that is as long as my arm, and in fact that's perhaps what makes birth trauma that bit more hard to work with, is because it can feel huge. So what you're looking for, and the light bulbs that might go off here just with these few examples are, if somebody's facing language barriers, of course they're much more likely to not feel safe if they're not understanding their experience. If someone has suffered any kind of previous baby loss, of course they're much more likely to find their experience a traumatic or triggering. People with a history of poor health or disability, those with coping strategies which perhaps lean towards numbing or avoidance or dissociation coming into a birth itself or into their perinatal journey. The LGBTQIA+ community is so important to remember here, because we still very much have a cis heteronormative maternity service that can lead many people within the LGBTQIA+ community to feel separate from, to feel othered, to feel that they're not welcome, particularly the trans community. Black, brown and marginalised groups, we know from research now that those who are racially identify as Black are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth or in the postnatal period. So there's a lot to learn there in that space around race and systemic racism. Housing and financial issues we know are interlinked as well. People who are displaced or seeking asylum, those who have a history of mental health issues, and then of course we've referenced prior to now abuse, sexual abuse, of course, being particularly relevant here. Next slide, please. So when you look at the causes of birth trauma, so this is is a really important list. I don't think there will be any surprises on here, but what plays out here as the main top 10 causes, and there are many others: lack of consent, some kind of medical emergency, fearing yourself or your baby may die, feeling out of control, silenced or alone, a particularly quick labour, or perhaps a very short labour, a very long labour, particularly with sleep deprivation. Pain perception and pain management is really important here. It comes up a lot. People who experience physical birth injuries, burnt out caregivers, absolutely key. Systemic challenges within the system, such as discrimination, and interpersonal factors too, really, really important here. Next slide, please. So interpersonal factors can cause extreme distress. So this is a hotspot study by Susan Ayres and Dr. Harris. And what they found was that, this is quite neatly chunked down into a third. They were looking for moments of extreme distress in the birth experience. And what they found was that in 36% of cases, those moments of extreme distress, which linked to PTSD symptoms, they linked to interpersonal factors. So here we're talking about being ignored, feeling unheard, feeling alone, and experiences like that too. So we might assume complications with the baby or obstetric complications would link to birth trauma. Interpersonal difficulties are so key. Next slide, please. Oh, this is a 1-minute slide that video that brings to life our Every Word Counts campaign, one that we run as often as possible, which just brings to life a bit more around language. So we ask people to share words that link to harm and those that link to healing. So these are a few examples of words that link to harm for these individuals.
Try not to abuse your power. I know we didn't choose to change. You might not want to lose your power, but having it so strange.
The next slide, please. So by contrast, we also hear lots of people share the words that made a difference. And these are just a few examples. And I know from my second birth experience that it couldn't have been more different. And I very much valued so many of the words and the interpersonal factors that those healthcare professionals showed me. I'll leave you to read that for one moment. Okay, next slide, please, Thais. So just to close here, there's a lot of work going on around interpersonal factors, a real awareness that our language around birth very much needs to move on. We need to begin to refer to all birth as birth. So this is a brilliant report come out through the RCM, very much co-produced with parents and professionals, suggesting that we consider other terms, so that rather than natural labour, we call it spontaneous vaginal birth. Rather than instrumental labour, we consider it birth with forceps or ventouse. Instead of an induction, we consider that induced labour or induced birth. And that with caesareans, that we perhaps shift away from just saying caesarean section, you know, was very medicalised, and we really validate that as birth, caesarean birth, sometimes called abdominal birth as well. So that's just a little tidbit of some of the brilliant research and suggestions that are going on out there. Next slide, please. So last few bits here, obviously more relevant for those healthcare professionals listening here, just remembering that PTSD and birth trauma are different. It very much presents on a scale, that we can identify risk factors, we can identify those who are more susceptible, and that we can work with that. We can really use those themes around the causes of birth trauma to improve prevention, and also to set up light bulbs when we perhaps observe those things happening for people. That we consider trauma across the whole perinatal journey, not just the birth itself, and that we really do focus in and consider around those interpersonal factors. So I did have a couple more slides, but I'm just going to reference one of them. So if you want more on any of the stuff I've covered, but particularly more on birth after trauma, support for partners, for professionals, free resources, more about our campaigns and our champions, just go to our website, makebirthbetter.org. Next slide. And then I will use this as my final slide. So I know someone's asked, and I'll refer back to this in the Q&As, but you know, is provision sufficient enough as one of the questions that's already been asked. When you look exclusively at birth trauma, whilst we're still seeing those stats that are shocking, 25 to 40% experiencing their birth as in some way traumatic, we have to acknowledge the shift in this country that has been made in 20 years. So, you know, in the 2000s, Susan Ayres categorically starting her research journey, facing people telling her it's not a thing, to 2022, to countless services, countless interventions, more and more conversations, acknowledgement in the long-term NHS long-term plan. I'll reference this more later, but we have come a long way, and of course we have a long way still to go, but that's such a hopeful and important note to finish on, that whilst birth trauma is not yet part of our language, things are absolutely moving in the right direction. So I'm going to leave it there today. And just thank you for having me, and a big thank you to Owen Mitchell for all of your support.
Thanks very much, Nikki. I think that was really fascinating and thought-provoking, and I'd encourage any of our attendees online to do put some questions in the Q&A box. Nikki and others will be available to answer those questions later on, and if we, as I said earlier, if we don't get to them in the live session, we will respond by email later on. Honestly, I thought that was really powerful. Thank you again. Our next speaker, who is Julia Pavia. Julia is a midwife who qualified a little while ago and has an MSc in midwifery, BSc in midwifery and a diploma in nursing. She specialises in community and midwifery-led care, and she also has managerial as well as clinical responsibilities. So I'm just going to hand over to Julia for the next part of our webinar session. Thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Good morning, everybody. So this presentation from myself is obviously the focus on maternal mental health and from a midwifery perspective. So next slide, please. So just about who I am, as Anne just outlined, my name is Julia Pavia. I've been a midwife for 19 years. I work for Somac and Associates. I'm an expert witness for those, as well as an associate trainer. I've written over 100 cases for different law firms, both defendant and claimant, and my areas of specialism run anything from community, predominantly community and midwifery-led care, but I do hospital, interpartum care, low and high risk, so CTG interpretations, perineal suturing, all antenatal care, postnatal care in community and the hospital. Next slide, please. So the purpose of my presentation is to identify perinatal mental health, the identification tools that are used in practice for midwives, the reports and statistics surrounding perinatal mental health, and some of the obstetric consequences of this, some of the disorders that I'm going to discuss that women can present with to the midwife, and what the role of the midwife is and the support services that are out there that we can refer into. Next slide, please. So this is the identification of perinatal mental health, and this that I've put a list on two sides, so risk factors and vulnerabilities. And either list is not exhaustive of identifying perinatal mental health in women. So the risk factors that we look for when we're doing the booking of a pregnancy would be history of mental illness, any family history of it, and that usually will predominantly go on mother's side, but it can be wider because we'll also have to look at the wider family. Either of the above solely within pregnancy or in the postnatal period, so previous deliveries, previous pregnancies that mums had. Any histories of childhood trauma, any eating disorders, any domestic abuse that's identified, and any alcohol and substance abuse that's also identified at the booking appointment. Vulnerabilities that we look at for women can be teenagers, teenage mothers, fathers, poor social environments, anybody who can have financial worries, who can impact how they perceive the pregnancy and how they can perceive what they can do for their baby. Personality vulnerabilities, previous birth trauma, and post-traumatic stress disorder, and obviously COVID-19, women having babies during the pandemic, or women that have had babies during the pandemic and now are pregnant again and has had an impact on that previous pregnancy. Next slide, please. So at the booking appointment, as a midwife, as a community midwife, we carry out a series of questions regarding the woman's obstetric and medical history. And these questions include women's social history, so again, kind of, financial worries or, housing, things like that. We'll look at a very wide spectrum of things to identify where women can be vulnerable. And this is kind of the first line in determining any risk factors or vulnerabilities that women may have from the onset of the pregnancy, and it's really important to pick these up early. Any previous birth trauma, and it's fundamental for midwives like myself to listen to this. And you find so many women who may say, that they've spoken to previous midwives or healthcare professionals who've just passed this off as being, well, that's just a normal birth outcome. But it's for the booking midwife and, the community midwife who they're going to go right through this pregnancy with, is to not see this as just an everyday event that we may see as health professionals every day, and acknowledge that everything within birth will affect women very, very differently. So on the left side of this slide is what's called a GAD-2 screening tool, which we use, and this is generalized anxiety disorder screening, and there's multiple screening tools. So there's GAD-7, which obviously has just got more questions, but this is what we kind of use as an outline. And this predominantly detects one anxiety disorder, but it can be helpful in identifying other conditions like PTSD. So the way in which this works is to determine if a woman scores 3. So if you can see, obviously on the screen there, we ask 2 questions, and we ask the woman to, rate this of kind of how she's feeling, whether it's not at all, whether it's several days, more than half of the days, or nearly every day. And what we look for is for women where they score 3 points, and this can be on either either questions where they're scoring 3. And then this is when further evaluations for specific disorders would be warranted, and then it would be for the community midwife to refer on to the appropriate service. And on the other side of the screen is depression identification questions. And this is a screening tool which is used to identify depressive disorders. And it looks at the responses given. So a no response to both questions would in the beginning in kind of a low threshold to rule out depression. But as community midwives, we also have to realise that sometimes women won't be completely honest, and that's usually for fear that they're going to get labelled with something. It's the stigma around mental health, you know, that the stigma that, you know, they can be depressed or feeling down. And so you have to just keep this at quite low level and not just take it as, oh, well, you know, Sharon said no to both, so we won't revisit that again. But what we're kind of looking for is if there's a yes to one or both of these. And again, you know, that will, you know, mean that further evaluations for specific depressive disorders would then be carried out, and for the community midwife to refer appropriately into the appropriate service. So these two screens are pretty much definitely used in the region I work in, but, you know, quite nationwide. These are the first screening tools that are used, and like I say, will allow the midwife to refer into the appropriate service, but to also acknowledge that, you know, this woman is going to need some more support during pregnancy. Next slide, please. So this is the reports and statistics that obviously come out, and findings from the latest Embrace UK, so perinatal mortality survey report, saving lives, improving mothers' care, and the lessons learned which have informed maternity care from UK and Ireland. And this was through confidential inquiries into maternal deaths and morbidity. And what these tell us is that maternal suicide remains the leading direct pregnancy-related cause of death over the first year within pregnancy and over the first year after pregnancy. And almost a quarter of all deaths of women during and up to a year after the end of pregnancy were mental health related. 67% of women who died by suicide, they looked at if improvements in care would it have resulted in a different outcome, and they thought that it possibly would have. Mental health specialist midwives are now in post across the UK, and that kind of came from the back of the Embrace report. And these are specialist midwives, so they support like the community midwives or the hospital midwives, but ultimately the women. And this enables staff to ensure that perinatal women receive the best care and the best outcomes possible. And this also keeps it that women from any background, so any social background, any ethnic background, that everything is kept to be level and equal. And they also provide awareness to women, and so they'll do that through leaflets, social media, posters, and this enables women to easily access help and reduce the stigma that's associated with mental health. And it might be that women don't want to talk to the community midwife in the first instance, or they think that, you know, all midwifery staff, you know, are automatically going to refer them to social services. But when the kind of were found that by doing it by leaflets, social media in particular, that women will pick this up, and then they'll be more likely to speak to their community midwives. Next slide, please. So this is obstetric consequences of perinatal mental health, and this is why it's so important that we pick this up very early. And advances in research are highlighting that multiple biological, psychological and social etiological pathways that are known to influence and associations between mental illness and the factors that may increase if this isn't identified early and increase the adverse obstetric and neonatal outcomes. So there's things like SGA, which is small for gestational age. And it's really important that we, you know, identify things like, you know, whether there is, you know, social backgrounds. So if women have got poor social backgrounds in terms of, you know, the social setting around them, smoking, you know, everything that can contribute to it, but looking at the underlying factors of whether these women, you know, have some, you know, perinatal mental health disorders. Preterm birth, and this is protecting the health of the neonate, protecting women and protecting the well-being of the mother, so higher cesarean section rates. Next slide, please. And these are some of the perinatal mental health disorders that women can present with. So this would be to the community midwife or the hospital midwives if they're going into clinics. So, you know, anxiety disorders, so pregnancy-related anxiety. So these are the generalized anxiety disorders that, you know, we've already spoken about, that the GAD2 questionnaire can highlight. Specific phobias that women do have, and it's fundamental that midwives should take these very seriously. So tocophobia is something that is a phobia of actual childbirth, and there's a lot of women that present with this, and that might be because of past birth trauma, but it also might just be that this woman has general, you know, anxiety, and this just becomes bigger and bigger when she is pregnant because she fears the loss of control within birth. And post-traumatic stress disorder. And post-traumatic distress disorder can occur for the first time in pregnancy, or it can reoccur or worsen in the perinatal period. And risk factors include domestic abuse, sexual trauma, and the traumatic birth experience if they've had that, you know, a previous, or if they've delivered this time and the community midwife is going out to visit them. And symptoms that, you know, we generally find are flashbacks, nightmares, and repetitive distressing images. And these can be set off, you know, as Nikki said, you know, what set things off for her. You know, these can be things that have to be acknowledged by community midwives and midwives as a whole, that what is, you know, traumatic for one person may not be traumatic for the other person, but it doesn't mean to say that it's not real and it's not affecting, you know, their lives and how they're bonding with their babies and, you know, how they're going through their pregnancies. Perinatal depression, and the incidence is between 10 to 15%, and antenatal is just as common as postnatal. And I think that's something that, you know, as midwives we need to you know, get out there and tell women that this is okay, you know, that this is, you don't have to just have postnatal depression just because that for a long time has predominantly been out there. And the most common complication of pregnancy is 40% of women being more likely to experience subsequent postnatal or non-postnatal relapse. Next slide, please. And of course, let's not forget the fathers in all of this. And when community midwives meet, you know, for the booking appointment, we do, you know, apart from obviously COVID where we couldn't, but some of the appointments were done, you know, via Teams, which was actually good in a way that fathers could be there too. And so you can meet them and build up a relationship with them just as much as the mother, because they are just as important. And midwifery services shouldn't forget that fathers matter too. So antenatal depression rates in fathers have, you know, have been said to be between 11 and 12%. Postnatal depression rates between 8 and 26%. And the overall rates of perinatal mental health illness is 9% in fathers. And these rates can rise to 50% if the partner, so the woman, has the perinatal mental health, and this can rise quite rapidly. And the condition can have less obvious symptoms, and sometimes you have to look a little bit deeper as a community midwife when you're meeting both of them and you're talking to the woman about how dad's coping and how he's getting along with the pregnancy, because sometimes fathers don't want to make a fuss. and you know, they predominantly see pregnancy, birth and delivery as very women central. So it can be more challenging for, you know, community midwives to identify, and it often begins later, and like I said, after, you know, often after the mother has presented with something. And it can be little things that you can pick up from what the woman can say sometimes, that maybe a partner's exhibiting changes in their behaviour, and that's, you know, fundamental for midwives to listen to. Next slide, please. So this is the role of the midwife. So, you know, right from booking appointment all the way through the pregnancy, you know, we are kind of very much there, and very much should be there alongside women. And this is to identify, you know, perinatal mental health in women as early as possible, and to not label women, not to, you know, put a label to just say, oh, well, you know, you're just anxious because you've never had a baby before, or, you know, as Nikki, you know, very rightly pointed out, every word that midwives say can have a detrimental effect on women. So not labelling them, and it's for the midwife to determine the most appropriate support services to refer into. So the reevaluation also is fundamental, that just because you may pick up on something at the booking appointment, not just to refer women and then never revisit it again, because that gives then women a feeling that it's just a tick box exercise from our point of view, and it you know, it absolutely isn't, and we should be there to reevaluate it, and, you know, just make sure that, you know, the support is there right throughout pregnancy, birth and the postnatal period. And this may require, you know, midwives to alter the schedule of care and to increase this. And this will ensure that first line, so if you refer, say, to, you know, primary care, and if that's been tried and failed, or, you know, suddenly we'll get, you know, somebody presenting with self-harm or, you know, suicidal thoughts, that this becomes apparent, it is very much that the community midwife can pick this up, and that she's got a relationship with the woman and can refer, you know, immediately into, so we would refer into perinatal mental health teams. Next slide, please. So as midwives, these are the kind of things that, you know, the support that's available to us. So we can signpost women into the GP, and, you know, have the GP speak with women and see whether they, you know, where they think they should refer to. Talking therapies. There's the perinatal mental health team. We would refer the woman into a consultant-led clinic for mental health. And there's maternal mental health services. Where I work in the Northeast, there's actually only one mother and baby unit at this time. So it's, you know, whilst things have come on a long way, you know, that there's still kind of, you know, probably a long way to go where women know that, you know, that there's somewhere safe for them to be cared for. And, you know, support groups can be amazing for women who feel very alone and they feel like they're the only person who's suffering with this. So we have Little Minds in Mind and Amazing Starts, and they can be fantastic for women to go and be with other women. Next slide, please. And basically, so any questions, that's my presentation done, and any questions you have, just direct to the Q&A session, which I can answer if I can, and be of any further help. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Julia. That was really helpful and followed on, I think, very well from Nikki's earlier presentation. Julia is staying, as she mentioned, for the Q&A later. And now we're going to turn to Dr. Nusrat Mir. Dr. Mir is a consultant perinatal psychiatrist and had held the position as consultant perinatal psychiatrist for the Sheffield, Rotherham and Doncaster perinatal mental health service between 2009 and 2021. He's now a consultant for the North Recovery Team, which is a community mental health team managing patients with severe and complex disorders in a deprived area of Sheffield. And Dr. Meir is going to present to us about PTSD following pregnancy and childbirth. Over to you, Dr. Meir.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Anne, for the kind invitation to this Maternity Matters event. And it's really lovely to be asked again to come and speak by Owen Mitchell. I'd like to say that it's been very interesting up to now, and I apologize if some of the things that I'm going to say may seem like they're being repeated, but obviously the presentations have been so good so far that we just have to cope with that. So I hope what I have to say in the next 20 minutes or so is of interest to both people who work within maternity services, also those that are in the legal field, as Anne didn't mention, but I'm also an expert witness. So I work in the medical legal setting as well, and of course to anybody else from general public. So what I'm going to talk about, can we have the first slide, please? So I'm going to give an overview of a condition you've heard mentioned already today, a post-traumatic stress disorder as applied to childbirth. I'm going to talk about trauma, birth trauma. I'm going to talk about the prevalence of PTSD, how we diagnose it from a psychiatric perspective, what the common features are, how we can get complications, and how we would manage PTSD after childbirth. I will hopefully be able to touch upon a case study from a medical legal setting, and I'd like to give you some take-home messages at the end. So, without further ado, the next slide, please. So we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder. We need to start at the beginning. And my definition of trauma, well, I've looked at common dictionary definitions of trauma, and I've come across a couple of different ones I've listed here. One was to describe trauma as a physical damage to the body caused by violence, by an accident, by some sort of physical injury, fracture, etc. But also it could be an emotional wound or a shock, often having long-lasting effects. And obviously, as you can imagine, myself working in the mental health field, I deal with emotional trauma very, very often and day in, day out, but also in the medical legal field, one sees coexistence of physical and trauma that is emotional. Interestingly, the word trauma has a Greek origin, which means wound. So a wound is what trauma is effectively. Next slide, please. So I know Nikki mentioned this earlier, but I just want to talk about birth trauma from a couple of definitions again. Birth trauma can be thought of as a negative and disempowering physiological and emotional response to birth. One can also think of a birth trauma as when an individual, whether it be the mother, father, or a witness, believes that the mother or her baby's life was in danger, that a serious threat to the mother or baby's physical or emotional integrity existed. So if that's birth trauma, how common is birth trauma? Next slide, please. This is overlapping again with what has already been said this morning, but research indicates that approximately 1/3 of women will, on average, experience or describe their childbirth as traumatic. That's a huge amount of women. That's every year. And birth trauma is a subjective experience. It's not necessarily what relates to what happened. It's how the woman herself experiences that event. And as we think about it, we reflect upon this. That means 1/3 of all women who give birth each year. That's approximately 200,000 women in the UK. That's about 1.2 million women in the US. And this has been replicated in studies in Australia, Canada, and in the UK. And if we think about it and extrapolate that to a wider worldwide view, I mean, if we looked at it from a perspective of parameters from these studies, which of course were Western industrialized nations, that would be like 40 million women across the world. But we know for sure that of course rates are going to be higher in the underdeveloped world, and that's been shown for perinatal psychiatric disorders. People like Professor Fisher, Jane Fisher from Melbourne, recently presented on this, because we know that in underdeveloped world, of course, health services are going to be less well developed and are going to be more rudimentary. So the trauma would be even higher. Next slide, please. I just put this slide in because I know from my own work in this sort of medical legal work, birth trauma and clinical negligence do, have a link. Of course, I don't need to tell the lawyers in the audience that obstetric negligence claims form the biggest proportion of negligence claims, nationally, because things like labor gets mismanaged. There may be mismanagement of complications of pregnancy. Sadly, we see, as we've heard today, stillbirth, neonatal death. There may be injuries that occur during the birth to the mother and the child. And also another thing that one sees again and again is problems where there's retained products of conception. Okay, so that's birth trauma. I'd like to talk a little bit about the next slide, please, just to introduce a concept that what I would say is perinatal psychiatric injury. And that is essentially a condition, a psychiatric condition that is associated with an event in the perinatal period around childbirth that may lead to a legal claim or leads to a legal claim. And in the next few slides, I'd like to talk a bit about causation of perinatal psychiatric injury. So if we could go on to the next slide. When I, as a psychiatrist, talk about causation or causal factors, I talk about factors that predispose to a particular condition, factors that precipitate a particular condition, and factors that perpetuate a condition. We apply that to psychiatric injury. If we go to the next slide, what in the sort of from a legal perspective, of course, lawyers are always looking at the causal factor as being the precipitating factor, and on the balance of probability, what actually caused and triggered this injury to happen. And if we look at the next slide, we go into a bit more depth. So we can see that there will be predisposing factors, past history of depression, history of birth trauma, anxiety in pregnancy. It's predisposing factors, but the actual precipitating or causal factors, I've split it into three different categories. There's perinatal loss, or things like stillbirth, neonatal death. There's traumatic delivery, emergency cesarean sections, instrumental deliveries like forceps and Ventoux. And of course, there's birth complications like postpartum hemorrhage happening, third-degree tears. And perpetuating factors are generic factors that may be that social isolation, and that's interestingly the talk on a reference to COVID pandemic would have, of course, very relevant, because that would have increased that feeling of isolation at the time. So there we have causal factors. And I think now, next slide, if we move on, I can talk about PTSD itself a little bit more. Post-traumatic stress disorder, for those who are not aware, originated from the Vietnam War. It was first described as a condition that soldiers were coming back with. Certain symptoms were being observed, and those that had seen the most trauma and been most injured had these symptoms more frequently, and one saw them much more frequently. Well, what were those symptoms, and what are those symptoms? How do we diagnose PTSD? So next slide, please. There are two classification systems internationally that are used when we make diagnoses in psychiatry. One is the ICD-10 system, which is used a lot in the UK and internationally, and there's DSM. This is taken, DSM being American system classification. So essentially, you need four parts to diagnosing PTSD. You need exposure to a traumatic event, and we agree that now birth trauma is accepted as a traumatic event. You need re-experiencing symptoms, that is, intrusive flashbacks, possibly nightmares, where that traumatic event keeps coming back and back into your mind. You need avoidance behavior, so that anything that reminds you of the trauma is avoided. Places where it happened, hospitals, roads where the accident happened, programs that remind you of the trauma. And there's the fourth thing, which is hyperarousal. That's a feeling of being on guard. That's a feeling of always looking over your shoulder because you're so worried that the same thing is going to happen to you again. You might not be able to sleep because you're so alert. The diagnostic point of view, you have to have these type of symptoms occurring within a month of the traumatic event, and they need to be within 6 months of the event, and they need to be present for at least a month. Okay, so that's the diagnostic criteria. In the next slide, I'd like to so I was jumping ahead, actually, just to point out that in terms of prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder after childbirth, some robust research has been done on this, and one of the best studies was done by Alcon et al. In 2010 from Queensland, Australia, and they did a prospective study following up women who had given birth, and found that at 3 to 6 months, roughly around 3% of women had PTSD. Now, my calculations would say that that's around about 20 or so, almost 20,000 women per year in the UK. So going on to the next slide, what I was thinking of was some histories that I've heard women tell me, illustrating PTSD. I'm sorry if these may be, distressing to some people, especially those who deal with this or have experienced themselves. But one lady told me that she could see images of the staff standing in the delivery room. Her partner was crying and seeing her son in the incubator. Those images kept coming back into her mind again and again. Next, another lady said she would repeatedly see images of having delivered her stillborn baby daughter in the toilet, in the hospital toilet, going round and round in her mind as she tried to sleep. Next one. The third lady said she kept picturing the midwife examining her in labor and seeing blood on her glove. She could relive the failed forceps delivery, and the words of the midwife, "You're nearly there," kept playing back over and over again in her mind. And then last one is a woman told me that she could still smell the scent of her daughter as she lay in the chapel of rest. So very, very distressing symptoms. And next slide, please. Themes that come around, that come up in PTSD after childbirth are things like poor communication. I wasn't listened to. I worried that the CTG wasn't right, but I didn't feel heard. Being treated inhumanely, feeling invisible. Impact on relationships being disrupted. Next slide. This is about then the impact. How does it impact? It's very distressing. Well, of course, it impacts on relationship. It can cause in disruption of sexual relations after childbirth. It can affect the bonding and attachment with the child, which, if not recognized, may lead to long-term developmental problems in the child. It can lead to parenting stress. And also the last few points are that it can change future plans. it leads to a fear of pregnancy, which has already been mentioned earlier. That is to say, it causes tocophobia. And if I go to the next slide, just to illustrate this, and that's this article in The Guardian, severe birth trauma has left me terrified of having another child. And I would say to those who work in maternity services, it's important to remember that tocophobia, fear of pregnancy, can occur as a secondary, as a complication of PTSD, and therefore we need to, the maternity staff need to screen for that in women who've had traumatic births. But also for the lawyers amongst you, it's really important when you discuss quantum, when you try to decide how much of a claim to make. You have to remember that if you have PTSD, you have to consider whether there's also been a tocophobia, fear of pregnancy, which may have led, in many cases I've seen, of young women saying, I'm not going to have another child again, and they leave it there. So the next slide, please. Just to say a bit about the management of PTSD after childbirth. Post-traumatic stress disorder is managed in a broad way, using may need medication. For some ladies, may need antidepressants, anxiety medication. But also the core treatment would be psychological, things like EMDR or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, or cognitive behavior therapy. The goals of these therapies are to help ease the anxiety that is experienced when you think about the traumatic event. And from a social point of view, there are lots of other things that have already been mentioned: support groups, maternity outreach clinics, various different organizations exist to give support. Next slide. For example, you know of SANS. This is a picture of a football team for fathers who are bereaved, trying to deal with their grief in a constructive way. And the next slide, another charity, Petals Charity, working on baby loss counselling. So that's how we manage. And now if I move on to the next slide, very, very quickly, I'll try, because I'm short on time, I know, just to show a case from the medical legal world I dealt with. This 21-year-old lady who had a third pregnancy, previous successful pregnancies, but had been affected by growth retardation, had a past history of having taken an overdose in her mid-teens, but was not under mental health services. Essentially, in her pregnancy, she was complaining of reduced movements and abdominal pain, presented sort of mid-30 weeks of her pregnancy, was sent home by hospital staff with antibiotics, but she re-presented, and sadly that second time it was confirmed that her baby had died in utero. She gave birth to a stillborn baby whilst she was on her own in the hospital toilet. Next slide. Just to say that I examined this lady, and my diagnosis was one of post-traumatic stress disorder. She was very hypervigilant, having flashbacks all the time. She hadn't come to terms with the loss, and hadn't really benefited from medication. I recommended she have some EMDR and have a higher dose of medication for her depression. But when I re-examined her, and over a year later, there still had been no sign of improvement. And so it was a case, sadly, of a poor prognosis, and she wasn't able to be fit to work. Okay, well, I will now just move to the last few slides, just to draw a few things together. I always like to try and do some take-home messages. So if you see birth trauma, do think about post-traumatic stress disorder. Do look out for the signs of post-traumatic stress, flashbacks, nightmares, hypervigilance. Always remember that those who have got a past history of psychiatric history, they're more at risk. And remember that birth trauma may lead to a fear of pregnancy, what we call tocophobia. We mustn't forget the mental health of partners. Some, very often they're helpless in places of observing what goes on, and there are cases of secondary victims in legal claims that I've dealt with. And the next slide, please. Do remember that there can be more than one psychiatric injury at a time. Depression can coexist. In severe cases, we must remember that just because a lady may go on to have another child, that doesn't mean the suffering goes away. And sometimes the child reminds them of the one that they lost, and that can really be very disabling. If you're in doubt, instruct a perinatal psychiatrist. The very last slide, just to wrap up, just to say that birth trauma is very common and it should be a focus of inquiry. Poor communication, loss of control, feeling ignored, key issues. PTSD does exist after childbirth, and it's a common type of perinatal psychiatric injury. Do remember tocophobia, but remember that good, effective evidence-based treatments also exist, and prognosis can vary depending on the past history, how they respond to treatment. And I think there's a last point, just to remember, those of you working in clinical negligence, to always consider whether you are thinking about this condition when you're assessing women who have gone through traumatic births. I could talk forever about perinatal mental health, but I've got to leave it there. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Dr. Meir. I think that was really thought-provoking again, and I suspect it's going to lead to some questions from our attendees. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Rochelle Mahapatra again. Rochelle is going to lead the panel Q&A and moderate questions which have come in already and those which are on the Q&A live today. Over to you, Rochelle. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anne. We've got our usual handful of technology problems, but we are trying to join Benesh Nazim, who is a specialist cultural liaison midwife, and she's also the director of the Association of South Asian Midwives. So hopefully we'll be able to welcome her in a few minutes, but we'll keep trying in the background to join everyone. Thank you very much to our speakers today. Really good presentations. Thank you also for staying for this Q&A. I'm going to try and deal with as many of the questions as I can. We've had a lot, and it's sparking an interesting debate. So we'll try and get through as many as we can, but we do need to stick to time. So thank you, Nusrat, for your presentation. The first one, I'm going to come to you, which is, have you talked a lot about the trauma side of it, and one of the people watching today has asked about an increase in medicalised birth, I suppose the intervention side of birth. Do you see that has increased mental health problems as well?
Thanks, Rochelle. Thanks for the question. I think thinking about medicalisation, I'd say on the one hand, I think if you get a sense from what I was saying about trauma, that of course, yes, the more interventions that there are, in a hospital setting, the more chances of things going wrong are there, and one would associate that with an increased risk of post-trauma, birth trauma, and yes, that is going to be a key precipitating factor for mental health problems postnatally. And I talked about post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's not the only one that happens after birth. So I think, yes, in a basic terms, it is likely that it has increased mental health problems, but also from another point of view, and we were thinking about this earlier, is about, for some women, of course, who really want to have a natural birth, not have interventions, have birth at home, and when things don't go to plan, it can lead to feelings of loss of self-esteem and feeling that they've failed in some way. And I'm not saying that happens in every single case, but of course for some women who've got a particular sort of mindset or focus on that, it can lead to feelings of disappointment as well.
I think those feelings of failure that, you know, they come through loud and clear when you talk to people. They get made to feel that, you know, they should have had a natural delivery. And the next question actually arises. We've already done one of the Maternity Matters presentations on feeding, but Julia, could you help from a midwifery point of view about what sort of advice do you give mothers, new mothers who are trying to breastfeed their children, and do we see an increase in sort of mental health, anxiety about failure coming out of that problem?
Thanks, Rochelle. Yeah, I think that as a community midwife, we see a lot of it antenatally to start with, when I think breastfeeding, you know, obviously that's very much put to women, that's, you know, breast is best, and, you know, phrases like that can start women thinking in their pregnancy that this is something that they have to achieve. So then when you get women coming out, you know, after delivering a baby, you've got all kinds of emotions, whether, you know, it's been, you know, how they wanted it and how they expected it to be, or whether it's been totally what they didn't expect. And then on top of that, they've got feeding problems. And the majority of women do find it difficult, and it's about midwives supporting their individual concerns. So, you know, you can go from house to house and feel, you know, find that the concerns of women are very different, but it's about being there for somebody individual and, you know, supporting them in what they need. And it's okay. You know, what I think the fundamental thing from my side is to make women believe in themselves, but also that, you know, it's okay if they need to express some milk and give it in a different format, not to have so much pressure on women. And then we've got services, we've got breastfeeding services that we can refer them into, but keeping a close eye on them is, you know, is a huge thing.
Thanks very much, Julia. Nikki, I've got a question for you, which is, you talked a lot about the support for new parents. What would you like to see hospitals doing to support parents when they're transiting into parenthood?
Hospitals specifically, was that the question? Hospitals specifically, yeah, okay, interesting. Oh, there's so much, isn't there? You know, I'm going to pick off one thing. So if you consider where we're at with investment in maternity services, and obviously hospitals themselves may not have the influence to change this, but they certainly can continue to lobby for that change. You know, we can't support people into parenthood if the start of that transition is within an under-resourced system. So, you know, we know that the number of midwives is severely lacking, that the investment of the government of 127 million falls all significantly short of the 350 million pounds that the Health and Social Care Select Committee suggested should be invested. So, you know, what we can do really collectively, hospitals and government and all of us, is to try to lobby for change. We can't expect people to have a smooth transition into becoming parents if they are not having a positive experience in the hospital itself.
Thanks for that, Nikki. That was yeah, very insightful. So I'm just Andy, we talked about, in fact, Julia talked in her presentation about the impact on fathers. I think most of you touched on it actually. And from your experience, Andy, you know, the impacts on your own mental health, you know, what would you like to be considered to change in respect of the, you know, the actual whole experience that you went through, and what would have helped you?
Yeah, so to be honest, I just felt whenever we went to any appointments, sometimes not always relating to what happened, but if, like, when we was having Isaac, our third child, we'd go to appointments, and it probably, I don't know, just the general sort of questions and and when they found out that we'd lost our second child, it was always like the attention always turned to the mother rather than the father. So it was turned to Whitney, and it was, oh, that must have been awful for Whitney, and it was never, oh, it must have been awful for both of you. So I always felt like it was not like it happened to the mother rather than it happened to us as a family. So I don't know, I just feel like there isn't a support there for the fathers, and the only really support I've had, I mean, Martin House was good, but the only support really was through my doctor, through my GP, and support I've been getting there, and I have been quite lucky that he is a very good supportive GP. But yeah, just generally really, of whenever we I don't know if it's like almost like a stigma of whenever we talk to anybody in the NHS or in general, it's always, oh, that must have been awful for your wife, not that must have been hard on both of you. I don't know, I always just assumed that the father was almost secondary really, but it was hard, and I'm sure there's lots of other fathers unfortunately out there in the same position as me, and it is very hard for every day.
Thanks, Andy, for sharing that.
No problem, thank you.
Next question is really probably for Nikki and Banash, but basically one of the questions posted is about the impacts of poor social backgrounds or different minority sectors of society on very poor outcomes in terms of birth. Now they've talked in the context really of the UK birth trauma statistics and whether they include a separation into those areas. I don't know, but Banash, do you want to go first?
Thank you. So there are some issues in general in the NHS when it comes to ethnic coding and monitoring of data in that regards. And I know there's been a big push about understanding and better understanding who we're providing services for and what's happening. But in my experience, I do feel that anecdotally our marginalised communities are underrepresented in the specialist services, often due to stigmas within the community, sometimes because health literacy around mental health and awareness around mental health is not at a general level, and therefore asking for help tends to be later on. If we get to that point, or recognition, we fail as clinicians sometimes to recognise as well and refer appropriately because of our own lack of understanding about how people from different communities and cultures may present with mental health concerns. You know, if we think about languages, and I always use this, that many languages don't even have a word for depression. So if there's no word for something you're experiencing and there's no communication in your household around what you're experiencing, how do you then communicate what you're feeling and how that comes up? And people often will come with psychosomatic symptoms. So they're so far down that spectrum that they're complaining about headaches and indigestion. And as clinicians, we then worry about our clinical symptoms and forget that actually our mental health is a factor, and having that quite a simple conversation around, are you sleeping? Do you find joy in your day? Have you thought about, what if you want to carry on with your day, and what's your processing and what's going on for you? And the simple conversations. I always say that I asked my mum once, are you feeling low? And her, being someone who doesn't speak English, said, what do you mean? Do you think you're better than me? Or do you think I'm on the floor? What's the question here? So sometimes our language is not appropriate and the way we approach conversations isn't appropriate. And there is definitely more literacy for clinicians in this area that's needed.
Nikki, is there anything you want to add from your experience?
Thanks, Beanish, and hello. I was in relation to the stats. I mean, the issue is the same as the kind of global issue, is that it's totally skewed towards women of white middle class, so women of white privilege. And basically, so to get to the analysis and to conclude that those who racially identify as black, brown, or from marginalised groups being more likely to experience birth trauma, that doesn't come directly from a paper, but it is very easy to extrapolate. So if you consider the Embrace report, the rates of stillbirth are higher. If you consider study by Henderson et al, women who are from minority ethnic groups are less likely to be given pain relief. If you consider the brilliant the systemic racism report that came out of birth rights, 2/3 of the people reported in there said they felt their race, ethnicity, or religion impacted the quality of their care. So you can quickly extrapolate from those factors that people in those groups are more likely to experience birth trauma.
Thank you both of you for those answers. The next question is about preventative measures in for women who are going into hospitals to have babies, or wherever they're having babies, and how can we help to prevent them suffering from mental health issues. They've asked for your top 3. I don't know, you might have more. Should I go to you first, Julia? Have you got a couple you'd like to throw out there? And maybe Nusrat, you could give us your top suggestions as well. Thank you.
Thanks. I think in terms of preventative, I think it's very much that, women, no matter who they are, where they come from, and, anything to do with, their background, that women should be equal and listened to. I'd probably say that was my top kind of preventative, because if women are listened to and their anxieties and fears are acknowledged by midwives, then I think you can form a relationship where you can talk to women, and you can talk at the antenatal appointments. You can figure out what the anxieties are and talk about those things. So different things. So forceps deliveries are very real, but if you can talk about it and talk about what a woman can expect and what is reasonable, then women may feel less anxious. And that's not to say that they won't come out the other end and have birth trauma from it, but giving them some kind of insight. I think listening and insight is probably my top 2.
And from your experience, Nusrat, obviously you're treating people after the event, but what would you say would be your top suggestions?
Well, I think what Julia said is very, very important. I think making sure that one takes a good assessment right at the beginning, takes a good history, and recognizes those women that have got pre-existing histories of mental health problems of any, whether it be mild to the most severe forms, that they are picked up straight away and been made aware of that there are services available now. Perinatal mental health services are much more available now than they were 6-7 years ago due to investment, and I think and say that, look, it's all right to express anxiety. It's all right to say if you're going to struggle, there is help out there. I mean, you can go into wider context of stigma around not being able to cope around childbirth, or worries that if you admit to being mentally unwell, somehow your child is at risk of being taken away from you. And unfortunately, these type of things do still happen, and these thoughts do persist. But I suppose greater recognition and identification at the beginning.
We'll move to the stigma of mental health and people wanting to admit problems in a minute. But Binash, is there anything you'd like to add to that in terms of preventative measures?
Absolutely. I think there is a need for mental health well-being and mental health literacy in our communities, and advocacy as well. There's often people who don't know how to articulate what they're feeling, and if they were able to better articulate, they may we may be able to better recognise support and refer. So there is preventative, prevention is better than cure, and therefore increasing this awareness in the communities, especially when intergenerational trauma can play a part. And if people's parents have been expected to get on with it, and then they are teaching their children the same, they have unhealthy coping mechanisms and they think they are fine until they're not fine. It's making sure that we get to them before they're not fine.
Thank you for that to all of you. Just moving on to another question which relates to the difficulties in healthcare when people actually are worried about admitting that they've got a problem. It sounds like it's large percentages. I mean, Nusrat, you talked about 3% of women suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. They're not on their own, but is there difficulties in identifying those people who are in the at-risk groups? Julia, can I come to you first?
Yeah, I think sometimes, women, like we've said, women don't want to admit, that they feel anxious or they're suffering, any kind of mental illness, because they see it as being a reflection on themselves and how they'll actually cope bringing a child up, and they think that people will view that badly, and then, like I said earlier, refer them to social services. I think there's a lot of that. It's forming, I think, one of the fundamental things that midwives do is we form relationships with women. We have to, when they come through the door in labour, we have to form that relationship very quickly, and as a community midwife you've got more time to do that. And it's just being there and waiting and waiting, discussing things, discussing what they want to discuss in terms of how they're feeling, and letting them articulate it in whichever way. And I think eventually women do come around to say, look, Julia, I actually feel absolutely rubbish, or I'm absolutely terrified, and then you can start to move through things and start to discuss how we can support women.
Thanks for that, Julia. We've actually had somebody post in the Q&A that there is actually the use of the Tommy's tool for digitising medical records, so hopefully that will help to improve some of the trust problems we heard earlier in Matilda's case about sharing medical records between different hospitals. We're actually up to our last question, which is amazing because we have so many, but if anybody else wants to post one quickly, we'll try and deal with it. Really, we're just moving on to the conventional treatments of mental health problems and talking about the use of antidepressants versus hormone treatments. I'm guessing, Nusrat, that was probably about your area at the moment. Would you like to deal with that?
Yeah, I can say something. If we're talking about, I'm assuming that's to do, we're talking about postnatal problems like postnatal depression and using antidepressants to treat as opposed to hormonal treatments and so on. Certainly from my perspective and my understanding of the literature, that certainly there is a lot of evidence that antidepressants do help treat postnatal depression postnatally, and especially when it's moderate to severe in its degree of intensity. And as a perinatal psychiatrist, I would, of course, always advocate that if it's needed, it will work. My understanding of the hormonal literature is that there isn't so much actual robust research backing up that hormonal treatments would be as effective, and that's just the way the literature is. I believe that there are more studies taking place on that front, but literature is very, very limited. And I would just say that, to anybody who does worry about postnatal depression and taking antidepressants, especially if they're breastfeeding, that shouldn't be a barrier. It's not a barrier to taking antidepressants. In fact, some antidepressants pass on very low levels in breast milk, and what is worse would be a woman who was suffering with depression, not only for herself but also the impact that it has on the bonding with the child. So I mean, that's as much as I would say about antidepressants and hormonal treatments.
Thank you very much for that. And just moving to I think it's our last question, unless any more come through, but really the difficulties that people who are part of the LGBT community and also people who identify as women, and how that community is affected when they are obviously seeking obstetric care. I don't know, Nikki, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think I said in my presentation that, you know, we still have a very cisgendered, heteronormative maternity service. I think even me using the language women and birthing people might have thrown some people in my talk. Similar to what I was saying before, you know, we can comfortably extrapolate, whilst we don't have the exact data on birth trauma in the LGBTQIA+ community, we can comfortably extrapolate that those within that community are more likely to have experienced or more susceptible to experience birth trauma, because they, you know, we have data on them feeling more discriminated against by healthcare professionals. We have data on their increased likelihood to have experienced sexual violence. The other thing here, I think, that's so important for people to be aware of, and I'm not quoting our work, I'm quoting AJ Silver's work here, is we have to move with the times, because if you look just at sexuality now and not gender, you look at people in their 60s now, 90% would identify themselves as either completely homosexual or completely heterosexual, 10% varying degrees of bisexuality. If you look at 18 to 24-year-olds today, that's 50-50. So half of 18 to 24-year-olds who are coming into our maternity services consider themselves, or would classify themselves as having a varying degree of bisexuality. So we have to consider this. There's no excuses really anymore. We have to consider, what does our system and our services look like if we remove this very cisgendered heteronormative view, and we consider that anyone can be a birthing person regardless of how they identify.
Sorry, I was just trying to get myself off mute. Always happens in the last minute of the presentation. We've also had a comment about your video, Nikki, about the impact of COVID on mental health, and how people have been affected by either not allowing their partners to be present to support them, but also some who'd only had them there for 10 minutes, and how that's really impacted or increased mental health issues. We're going to have to finish there because we're exactly on 12:25. So I'm just going to hand back to Anne.
Before we do, sorry, Rochelle, I think, Banesh, you wanted to add something.
Oh, I think I just wanted to add to Nikki's point. I think sometimes we can be quite compartmentalised when we think of marginalised groups, and we think someone's in this box and this box and in this box and this label and this label, but we have intersectionality, and you're going to find those that are the most vulnerable and often least likely to get the support they need are the ones who have many intersections, maybe neurodivergent from the LGBTQ+ community, with you know, maybe a religious difference or from a different diverse ethnic background, and all of that adds on additional daily barriers that they face just in their day-to-day without even going through a service that may be hostile, or may they just not know how to navigate.
Thanks very much, Banesh. Sorry that I didn't bring you in at that point. We are now going to have to close though, and I'm just going to hand over to Anne just to wind up the session. And thank you very much again for all of you joining today.
Thanks very much, Rochelle, and thank you to all of our speakers, particularly to Andy and Whitney, who spoke about the loss of their baby girl, Matilda, as well as to all of our professional speakers, to Dr. Meir, to Nikki Wilson, to Julia Pavia, and finally to Vanish Nazmeen, who joined us at the last minute for the Q&A panel discussion. For those who have submitted questions by email or who still have, 3 minutes, we'll try to get to them and send responses to you by email afterwards. There will be a feedback questionnaire in the Q&A link shortly, and please do complete that. It helps us to finesse and to consider subjects for future webinars. And finally, there will also be a link to the next in our Maternity Matters webinar series, which will be on the 15th of November. And this will focus again on mental health issues, but with a specific focus on bereavement and baby loss. And I do hope you can sign up and join us then. Once again, thank you to everyone and have a good day.